I'm now turning to something that's called localization theory, and this fits into the sequence of ideas as follows. You will remember there was something called equivalence back in the day when people thought there was some kind of certainty to the way an ST and a TT went together. And that epistemological certitude was challenged by what we saw as Scopus theory or the purpose paradigm, which argued that the one ST could be rendered as any number of TTs according to the purpose in question on the target side. And that was one kind of challenge. More to the point, it was a response to this crisis within the equivalence paradigm, the uncertainty that entered. Descriptive translation studies then had an alternative approach to this crisis. It said, okay, if they're all translations, then they're all equivalent by definition, because a translation is always equivalent. And now we have to find out what they are equivalent to and how equivalence is working. And that is another approach, also based on the target side. Today, though, we're looking at yet another way of addressing that same fundamental problem. And a fundamental tenet of localization, viewed in these terms, would be that, hey, you know what? We can create equivalence. We can create it because we are the guys who have the authority to say what is equal to what. It's an act of power. Where does power reside in translation, in localization, and the people who developed it? Localization theory comes from the late 1980s by a guy named David Brooks, who was working at Microsoft. So it really does come from the hardcore of big bad global capitalism. And it originally addressed the problems of software. It was a cost problem. When, for example, Word version 1, if you can remember, no, you can't remember, but imagine back in the day there was a version 1 or 2 or 3. To translate that piece of software from English into any of the European languages, which were their first major markets, was costing a lot of money. And then we had updates. And how do we do the updates? It's going to cost a whole lot of money. And the translation budget was huge. And so Brooks and his team got down and developed an alternative approach to handling this problem. And the results are consequential. I want to show it on a more theoretical level, though, before we get to the solution that he came up with. If you think about globalization in general, we would assume that we have a global economy and that this, in essence, removes local differences. And people cite global McDonald's, for example, and McDonald's culture taking over the whole world, big bad globalization, all right? At the same time, of course, we have the growth of a global lingua franca, which is English. And this would also be removing local differences. And so we would expect, logically, that if there is similitude through economic globalization and the development of one common language through which people can communicate, we would have a declining use of translation. We should see the global translation market getting smaller over time, right? Wrong. What's interesting is that wherever you look in the data, the global market for translations is growing so far. I won't say it will be growing in 10 years' time, because we're going to have to factor in the impact of machine translation, neural machine translation. But at the moment, the trends are uniformly upwards towards growth. This is 2019 in the United States, 19% growth over a 10-year period, much faster than average. In Canada, job outlook over the next 3 years, good. In China, we have, that should be 2018 there, we have 13% annual increase for large language service providers. These are big translation companies. 1% for smaller companies, which is interesting for me. That's why I calculated that. But we have claims in 2019 of a general growth of 10% per year, obviously focused in the larger cities. Growth in China is coming basically through government outreach, selling a good China story to the world, but also equipment manufacturing, conferences, film and television. Okay. Slater report, 21% from 2019 to 2022. That comes around 7% growth, which is healthy. The Eurostat data is interesting here for that period. We get a massive growth, 86% for large companies, large language service providers, 250 employers or more, but actually negative growth for smaller companies, which sort of fits into what the Chinese statistics indicated. Big companies are getting bigger and richer, and smaller players are not doing so well, or perhaps are going backwards. NIMSI is a group of the top 100 companies working in this field, and they predict a global annual growth rate of 7.4%, which should continue. And they can point out where that is happening. It's a market dominated by the United States, the United Kingdom. So English is dominant, is the dominant language in which the software is produced, but also the technologies that are getting produced. Germany, and then China is becoming a major player down here. Okay, that's an overview of the market. And that overview suggests that even though we have globalization, it's not global similitude that is reigning. And as globalization increases, translation also increases. That's what we have to explain and understand, that apparent paradox. Translation should be disappearing. So far, it's not. Why? Here goes for the demonstration about why localization is not the same thing as translation. You know, people generally know translation exists when it goes wrong, okay? Otherwise, it's invisible and people don't care much about us. But when it goes wrong, they care. Same for localization. Here is a bit of software that I should not have got, because I know back in the day, I didn't pay money for software. So I got all these crummy little things. Error has been occurred. What language is that? Defective English. We're used to that. What intrigues me is that this text has three kinds of language. It has correct English for the name. It has defective English here. Four languages. We've got an international global symbol, which is part of the deal. And then this is in Spanish, and I can only aceptar. All right. How did this come about? Well, it's been developed in correct English. Somebody has not been a professional translator. Somebody has put in something there that is just good enough for localization purposes. And this has been picked up, this bit of text, from the operating system of the computer. So in fact, what we have in front of us is not a text that has been produced by one human or by one translator. It's a text that's been produced by a series of algorithms or mathematical instructions to compose the text by picking up that bit from the operating system, reproducing that bit from the name of the software, and inputting that bit by somebody who has not been well trained in English, and borrowing an international symbol there. Okay, so the text is produced by algorithms. That's what I want to get to. You can see this again. This is from the same years. I got English up here, Spanish there, Spanish down here. So the composite text is produced by algorithms. My favorite example of this is this Catalan calendar. You can see from 2003. And in English, we know if it's Monday because it's got an M, Tuesday's got a T, Wednesday's got a W, and so on. In Catalan, guess what? Monday is dilluns, dimarts, dimecres, dijous, divendres, dissabte, diumenge. D, all the way D. Every day is a D day, and you have no idea what day of the week it is. So you put it back into Spanish or into English, so you can at least see it working. All right, so this is a localization mistake. It's not a translation mistake. I hope you will agree. It's a localization mistake. Why? Because of rule-generated text production, the algorithms. The algorithm said, for target language X, find days of the week, select the first letter of each day of the week. And that's your algorithm. And it works for lots of languages, probably for yours, not for Catalan. Okay, so localization problem. How did they solve it? The way localization problems are solved is also different from translation. If you check your calendars, you'll see these days they have 2 letters instead of 1. They make the text bigger. The text, the software. The software gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and this addresses most of the localization problems. So what is localization? In the theory, this is taken from the LISA, was the Localization Industry Standards Association, which was influential for a while and then went bust. But anyway, its definitions remain. You take a product and tailor it for a locale, and a locale is the receiving language and whatever else is pertinent to the product, okay? And within that localization process, translation concerns work on the bits of language. A string is just a sequence of characters that are visible to the user because there's lots of code in the software that we don't see. Those bits that we see go from one language to another. So translation is what it always was, but it's within a localization process. So localization would be translation plus X. What is X? X, the most important X is internationalization, and we're going to come to that in a minute. And then what we would normally call adaptation. So the date, time, currency conventions, this is for software, have to be adapted to the target locale. And then significant product reengineering. If I'm working in English, to open is Control O, open, all right, hotkey. And in Spanish, it's Control A, all right, abrir. But if you go from A to O for the hotkey, then all of those hotkeys have to be reassigned, so there's not a doubling up. And that's an interesting little mathematical exercise for somebody. And then that's complicated. So you have to test the product to see if it actually works. This is what didn't happen in the COVID-19 translations in Australia. Okay? It was not when we had different languages being put on the same in the same document. It was not a translation problem. It was a localization problem and a lack of product testing. There you go, right? And a problem of project management. So all these things are the non-translation part of localization. And localization theory addresses how these people work together. In a localization project, in software or a major website or product documentation, about 30% at best of the budget will go to translation in the traditional sense. The rest goes to all these factors, and a big chunk should go to the project manager, who usually goes crazy getting things done on time. People in translation studies, though, when this paradigm came from industry, from Microsoft and then the software industry, and we said that, and we can see this is the way they were handling translation. People in translation said, as people in Scopus theory especially, well, that's just adaptation. You know, we had this table of translation solutions and we had text tailoring down the bottom. They would say, well, everything they're doing in localization is just text tailoring of some kind. And so there's nothing new. And in fact, localization would be one small part of translation for the people in translation studies. For the companies using this approach, though, it's very clear to them that translation is just one small part of localization, because we saw all those other things that are happening. And so there's two different languages, two different discourses that confront each other here. I personally think that it's very clear that in the industry, translation is a small part of localization. Well, small part, 30% at most. To illustrate the difference between localization and translation, here we have STTT, okay? With a double arrow for some kind of really strong bidirectional equivalence. That would be translation, as the equivalence paradigm certainly saw it. Localization begins by saying we cannot work from the ST because that's too expensive. And the original thing was to take that original American English version of Word, Microsoft Word version 1, and take out all the American bits. Take out the reference to dollars, take out the way the days of the week are named, take out the currency convention, what did I say, currency conventions, time conventions, all right, and put algorithms in place of them, and you get this internationalized version, which has been stripped of its local features. And from there, you're going to go into many, many target languages, okay? And that will be your localization process. There are two steps to it. The first is called internationalization. That's what's new. That's why it is really different from translation. And the second is your localization process, proprement dit, as such. Okay. Of course, what happens over time is that word mark 1, it disappears, it's old, it's been, lots and lots of revisions. The revisions and updates take place in the internationalized version, which can now run on its own and goes into the many target languages, including the original language. So once the system is set up, once you get the database going, the MT going, the terminology going, you can get rid of the original and only operate from the internationalized version. And that's why we talk about localization. But the trick, the thing that sets it up, is this first step, which is internationalization. Internationalization can be very clearly seen in the history of character encoding. Back in 1963 with ASCII, we thought that we were pretty good because in computers, we could write with 128 characters, which handled English and a couple of European languages. A bit later, we went to 8 digits. It gets a bit bigger, right? That is, for each letter that you write or character that you write in your computer, there are these codes corresponding to each. You go to 7 to 8, you get more, all right? That wasn't enough though. You go to 16, you get a lot more. But if you go to what we have in 12.1, 2019, you get a lot more. And these days you can see the original part of the 128 characters allows a whole lot more. It's grown to be a whole lot more characters that can be produced. How is that possible? Because the software gets bigger. And that's the one thing we know about the software that we're dealing with. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Why? Because it can handle more localization problems. So it's the same thing as we saw with the calendar, which went from one letter to two letters. Here we can handle all these characters, all the Chinese, all the Thai, everything you like, simply by allocating more space. So when we look at claims like the singularity that I hope we saw previously, where the human intellect grows at that rate and machine intelligence is called, grows exponentially, such that the machines would be more intelligent than the humans. No, what's growing is processing capacity in the machine, like the ASCII codes, like the codes for the character encoding. And that's not necessarily the same intelligence with which one solution is selected from many. What is a locale? A locale is a place that has placeholders. It's a sequence of placeholders in a text where algorithms will fill in the local values. So a locale for German in Germany will have, for example, a way of presenting the days of the week. Okay, it'll tell you in Germany that the first day of the week is Monday, not Sunday, for example, right? And ways of presenting numbers and things like that, right? And you get all those variables established as values put together, and that's a locale for the purpose of this particular software. The same logic could be applied to marketing, where a locale would be your target buyer audience or potential buyers, and they might have, instead of these values here, they might have things like age, gender, income level. Okay, but the logic is the same. You establish in your settings the factors that are pertinent to that locale, and that then enters into the algorithms. So the internationalized text, think of a website, for example. You don't have a price written there. The translator doesn't actually write in a price. And instead of doing that, they'll put in an algorithm which says, go to the current exchange rate between American dollars and Australian dollars, do the calculation and put in the result here. Okay. The same thing happens, that same logic. It's not a translation thing, it's rule-governed text production thing. That same logic works for bits of text, and that's the next thing I want to illustrate. The same as the prices. Go for that, pick up the price and put it in here. We can conduct a site, a website, for example, or product documentation, or a help file, from the various bits of information we have, and that's called our content. The content is arranged in chunks or information objects. And it's pieced together. So Caterpillar English, this will be familiar to you. Its content comprises 70,000 terms, a restricted syntax, and style sheets. And this we met as pre-editing. What is pre-editing? Pre-editing, now we can say pre-editing produces an internationalized version in English that can then go into many target languages very quickly. And it goes there by managing the content as information objects that's been produced. This means that language workers now find employment not just as translators, but as all those X factor things. And the X factor is controlled writing or technical writing. I observed in the United States that there are quite a few courses in technical English or technical writing. In Europe, where I worked for many years, there are lots and lots of programs training translators. Why does one continent train technical writers in English and the other continent train translators? Hey, because the technology is developed over here and internationalized here with the technical writing and then received and translated over in Europe. I might add in Australia, although Australia does produce some software. Obviously, there's work created for terminology in producing and controlling the internationalized version and then the transfer into all these languages. Lots of work for terminologists. There are places in the text that require new writing. That is, it's not entirely rule governed. We'll see some examples in a minute. And so we have a place for people to write new text in a new language alongside all the rule governed text production. The content, the assets, the things that we have that produce our electronic texts can be bought and sold. So the databases that are in our translation memories and in machine translation can be bought and sold. They have value. And so there is work for people to go over and ensure the validity of those databases or make sure that they're clean. The integration of machine translation into this entire process has created lots of work for engineers. That's to set up the content, the database, the glossary that gets sent out to translators. And then putting the whole thing together, project management is one of the growth areas, and growth areas in income as well. What does localization do? You would think that this entire industry is dedicated to imposing one language on the world. Quite the opposite. It's a commercial industry. It wants to sell products to the world, and they know that you sell a product in the language closest to the potential user or buyer. And so there is a move towards localizing as much as possible. At the same time, the product may be exactly the same all over the world, and as are the technical ways in which we interact with language through computers. There's enormous homogenization, but it goes along with a desire to make the product appear to be close to the user. The worrying thing is that this way of working with language, although it does maintain locales and locality within globalization, we talk about localization in that respect, although it does that, and that may be admirable, it does mean that the receivers are positioned in a periphery where they are only working with the product in their own language. It is very, very difficult for them to become producers of internationalized versions in the center. And so it's a very center peripheral mode of work that is set up with restrictions on who can get to the center. To demonstrate the desire to bring a product closer to the consumer, I just point to the number of varieties of language that Microsoft purports to market in and to produce software for. These are just some of the countries. You can select the kind of Spanish that you want to use. There's not a great difference between them, but just the ostensible desire to have your language variety incorporated into the software is part of the marketing ploy. McDonald's does the same thing. It markets itself towards very local tastes all over the world, as you can see there. Oh, and Coca-Cola does the same thing. I went to a Coca-Cola shop in Las Vegas, and it's something like 64 different Coca-Colas from all over the world, some of which are truly horrible, and some of which were really exotic. So, hey, okay, don't denigrate global capitalism out of hand. There is the attempt to use localization on the level of products as well as language. And this is what I was getting to as well. This is an example of a chunk. It's an information object. It's the welcome script for a particular product that you have seen. I found this on the product wrapping when it came, on the product presentation, the physical product presentation. Inside in the startup procedure, a shortened version of the same thing. And then further on, I found a longer version of the same thing. What's happening here? The one chunk is being modified to fit in with available space or perceived concerns of the user. And you can see the way the one text can be reworked slightly in English within the internationalized version. What does this mean? Well, texts, the kind of text that we work on as translators, become objects. They become information objects in some of their terminology, or chunks, as I've just seen, or content elements. There are many, many terms, but information objects is fine. They are written in such a way that the text that we see on the screen or on a website is often composed by the rules that put it together, by the algorithms, in such a way that there's no linearity. Now, this fits in with the way the texts are received. So think about a piece of software. Is it possible or even conceivable to read a piece of software from beginning, middle to end, like Aristotle said for dramatic text? Not really. Product documentation. Does anybody read a car manual from beginning to middle to end? No, it doesn't make any sense. It's not written that way. It's not meant to be used that way. You go to the index, or if it's online, you use the find function to get to the little information object that you want to solve your particular problem. Studies on websites show that there's also non-linearity. There's it's a classical T or F function. People read across the top and then down in a very vertical way, usually, depending on the website, obviously. But websites are not received left to right, left to right, left to right, or right to left, depending on your language. No, they're received in a non-linear way as people scan through them to find the little bit that they want, which is why images have become tremendously important for communication in this way. So what's interesting is that these texts, the texts that are used in localization projects, the kinds that people receive, they are received in a non-linear way, and so they are written in a non-linear way. Remember what we said about pre-editing or technical writing. You remove all the deictics. You don't use pronouns or proforms. You don't say, as we have seen, as we will see. The text has to be a coherent unit in itself because it's going to be slotted above or below or next to other units written in the same way. And we can't tell how that's going to happen down the line. So localization interacts with language in peculiar ways. It makes text reception and text production non-linear and therefore non-narrative. And that may have profound effects on the way we interact with language. We will wait and see. Okay. I think I'm going to leave that there. That's enough for the theory of localization. Important point, localizations incorporates internationalization. That's why it's really different from translation. And second, it can have consequences, not just for the configuration of the way we interact with products and technologies, but also for the way we use our languages. We're going to see some actual examples of this in the next lecture.